What's the problem with my baby's name? After years of heartbreak, countless fertility treatments, and what felt like an eternity of waiting, I was finally pregnant. My husband, Ryan, and I were absolutely ecstatic. For as long as I could remember, since I was a starry-eyed 12-year-old, I'd known precisely what I would name my daughter. So, one evening over dinner, I shared my perfect, cherished name with Ryan. He just stared at me across the table, his eyes unblinking, for what felt like an impossibly long time before he finally choked out, "You're joking, right?" I laughed, thinking he was teasing me about how long I'd been planning it, but his face remained unsettlingly serious. He asked if I had a backup. No, I said, this was the only name I'd ever wanted for a daughter. Ryan rubbed his temples like a migraine was forming, mumbling, "Well, if you're absolutely sure," but the words seemed to physically pain him. When I pressed him, asking what on earth was wrong with the name, he just shook his head and quickly changed the subject. A cold knot of confusion began to tighten in my stomach. The very next day, I bravely told my mom over lunch. She literally spit out her coffee, sputtering and coughing until she finally caught her breath. Then, with wide, bewildered eyes, she asked if Ryan and I were having problems. "No," I insisted, "everything is perfect." She just stared at me, shaking her head. "Then why," she whispered, "why would you do that to your baby?" I was completely baffled. She simply repeated that she couldn't believe I was serious, then stood up and left the restaurant without even touching her meal. My sister's reaction was even worse. When I told her at our weekly coffee date, she immediately pulled out her phone, frantically typing. She shoved the screen in my face, asking if that's how I planned to spell it. When I confirmed the spelling, she gasped, "Oh my God, you're actually serious?" and burst into tears. Real tears. She begged me, pleaded with me to reconsider, but absolutely refused to tell me why, only saying our baby would never forgive me. My mind raced. What was I missing? I spent hours on the internet, desperately searching for anything remotely problematic about the name. Did it mean something offensive in another language? Was it tied to some obscure, horrible historical figure? Nothing. All I found were benign facts, a traditional name, Welsh origins. There was absolutely nothing that could explain why everyone was acting like I was condemning my child to a lifetime of shame. At my baby shower, the carefully chosen pink decorations and tiny onesies felt overshadowed by a thick, suffocating tension. When my aunt innocently asked what name we'd chosen, and I told her, the entire room went silent. You could literally hear a pin drop. My cousin actually gasped, and my mother-in-law, without a word, got up and left the room. My best friend, Stella, pulled me aside, her voice tight with desperation. "Please, tell me you're pranking everyone," she pleaded. "This isn't funny anymore." When I insisted I was serious, her face fell. "You need professional help," she said, and then she walked out, leaving the party early. I felt like I was losing my mind. I posted in 3 different parenting forums, begging for answers, asking if there was something inherently wrong with the name. Every single response assumed I was trolling. The moderators deleted my posts and banned me from 2 forums for creating drama with obvious rage bait. One person even private messaged me, warning that if I was serious, I should be reported. Reported? For a name? My own workplace became a minefield. Someone saw my baby name list on my desk, a single, solitary name written on it. By lunchtime, whispers followed me like a shadow. People stopped talking when I walked by, and I even saw a coworker crying in the bathroom. No one would sit with me in the break room anymore. That afternoon, my boss called me into his office, his face grim. He said multiple people had filed complaints about feeling uncomfortable. He told me my joke about the baby name was creating a hostile work environment and that if I didn't stop telling people I was planning to use that name, he'd have to take disciplinary action. I tried to explain it wasn't a joke, but he cut me off. Nobody believes you're actually going to name a baby that, he said, shaking his head. The confusion, the shame, the sheer isolation, it was overwhelming. And honestly, if you're still with me, still wondering what on earth could be so terrible about a name that it would cause this much chaos, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. You truly won't believe what happens next. I begged Ryan again, desperate for him to just tell me. But he just said, if you can't see it yourself, then maybe it's better you don't know. His words were a punch to the gut. Then came labor. 16 grueling hours. When the admitting nurse asked for the baby's name for paperwork, her entire demeanor shifted the moment I said it. She excused herself, returning with 2 other nurses, all of them staring at me as if I was utterly insane. One asked if I was sure I'd heard the name correctly, suggesting perhaps the contractions were confusing me. After 16 hours, our beautiful daughter was born. The delivery nurse asked for the name to put on the birth certificate. She visibly flinched when I told her, but she wrote it down anyway, her hand trembling. She handed me the certificate to review, and I could feel everyone in the room watching me with a mixture of pity and horror. I stared at the paper, at the carefully written name I'd loved my entire life. Gwen. Did I just ruin my daughter's life? The pen felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Ryan shifted in his chair by the window, still avoiding my gaze. My hand started shaking so violently I had to set the pen down. I picked it up again, slowly signing my name on the mother's line. The nurse practically snatched the clipboard and sprinted out of the room. 20 minutes later, the pediatrician came in for the newborn check. She walked to the bassinet, stopped dead when she saw the little card with my daughter's name. Her whole body stiffened. She pulled out her phone, typed something furiously, then shoved it back into her pocket. She picked up my baby, but kept shooting these bizarre, uneasy glances at me the entire time. She barely said 2 words, just a clinical examination, then left without any of the usual new parent advice. Ryan finally came over to hold our baby while I tried to eat the hospital breakfast. When I asked him, again, what was wrong with the name Gwen, his voice cracked. He just said we'd talk about it at home. The way he said it made my stomach ache worse than any recovery pain. Around noon, a woman in business clothes knocked and entered, carrying a folder. She introduced herself as a hospital social worker, doing routine rounds. She asked about my feelings, my support system, then, in a meticulously careful way, started asking about our name choice. She kept circling back to family decisions, and whether we'd considered all our options for the baby's identity. It felt incredibly weird, pointed, like she was trying to get me to confess something. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message request from an unknown number. The preview read, "Please search your baby's full name plus your city before you leave the hospital." My hands went cold. I opened the message, but the account had already been deleted. Ryan was changing the baby's diaper and didn't see me grab my phone. I typed, Gwen, our last name, our city, into the search bar, but the hospital Wi-Fi blocked half the results as sensitive content. The few links that loaded showed partial headlines about some local case from 3 years ago. Local woman convicted in. Was all I could see. Community mourns after. My heart pounded. My mom arrived around 2, a huge bouquet of flowers and a teddy bear in her arms. Her smile vanished the second she saw the bassinet card. She dropped the flowers onto the table, grabbed my hand, and begged me to reconsider, before it's too late. She promised to explain everything once we were somewhere private, not here, with all the staff around who might hear. The way she kept glancing nervously at the door made my anxiety skyrocket. She stayed for an hour, making small talk, but her upset was palpable. After she left, the social worker returned with a stack of pamphlets about postpartum adjustment and identity considerations for newborns. She sat down, explaining how easy name changes were in the first few weeks, before paperwork was filed with the state. She had a whole folder of resources on the legal process, stressing how simple it would be now versus later. She left her business card on my nightstand, saying to call if I needed support with difficult decisions. That evening, after the nurses changed shifts and we were finally, truly alone, Ryan broke down. He pulled his chair close to my bed, his voice a raw whisper. He told me there was a woman with our daughter's exact full name who had done something terrible in our area. His company had employed her, and he'd even been questioned by the police as a potential witness, though he barely knew her. He said he hadn't told me during the pregnancy because he thought once the baby came, I'd naturally pick something else. The way he said, "something terrible," made my chest feel impossibly tight. He wouldn't give me more details, just kept apologizing for not telling me sooner. I held our baby, staring at her perfect little face, trying to comprehend how her name could be connected to something so bad that everyone acted like this. The weight of not knowing the full story, coupled with everyone's horrified reactions, was making it hard to breathe. My beautiful daughter was only a day old, and already I could feel the shadow of whatever this other Gwen had done hanging over her. I needed to find out, but a terrifying part of me was scared of what I would discover, scared of why everyone thought I was ruining my baby's life with the name I'd loved since I was 12. The door burst open. My mother-in-law, carrying a gift bag, walked in, her face hard when she saw the bassinet card. She dropped the bag onto a chair and demanded if we'd fixed the situation yet. When I shook my head, she grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We need to talk privately, right now," she snapped, practically dragging him into the hallway. I sat there, cradling my baby, listening through the closed door as her angry voice grew louder and louder, though I couldn't make out the words. Ryan came back 10 minutes later, his shoulders slumped, unable to meet my eyes. The discharge nurse knocked, entering with a clipboard full of paperwork. She went through each form until she reached the birth certificate section. Her hands fidgeted as she gently suggested we might want to review the name one more time before filing it with the state, since changes got harder after that. She left the form on top of the stack, saying we could take our time. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Have you come to your senses yet about the name?" The message had an attachment. When I opened it, there was a screenshot of a news article from 3 years ago, with a woman's photo at the top. The preview text showed our daughter's exact full name. The rest was behind a paywall. I tried clicking through, but the subscription page kept popping up. 2 days later, we were finally home. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her crib when I remembered my sister's text. I got my laptop, logged into the library website with my card, and accessed their newspaper archives. After 20 minutes of searching, I found the full article. My hand started shaking so violently I almost dropped the laptop. A woman with our daughter's exact name had been convicted of causing a drunk driving accident that killed 2 children from our area. The article had chilling photos from the trial, showing her in court. It detailed how she'd been going over 90 miles per hour, ran a red light, and slammed into another car. The prosecutor stated she showed no remorse during the entire trial, even smiling when the victims' family members gave their statements. She received 15 years in prison, but the family's heartbreaking words echoed, no amount of time would bring their children back. Ryan's company name was mentioned as her employer, stating several co-workers had been questioned as potential character witnesses. I clicked through to the comments sections, where hundreds of local people had poured out their grief and rage. They wrote about how they'd never forget that name, how it was burned into the community's memory forever. Some admitted to tearing down her missing person posters when her family initially reported her missing, thinking she was a victim. Others mentioned they still got angry just hearing the name, unable to separate it from the horrific event. A few commenters even admitted to harassing people on social media who had any connection to her. Ryan walked into the room, saw what I was reading on the laptop screen. He sat down next to me, his face drawn. Finally, he told me he'd been getting hate mail at work ever since the trial. People found out he worked at the same company and started sending him angry messages, even though he'd only met her twice at company events. He showed me screenshots on his phone, emails calling him terrible things just for being in the same building. He repeated his excuse: he didn't tell me during pregnancy because he thought once the baby came, I'd naturally pick a different name, and the whole thing would just go away. My mom called that evening. When I told her I finally knew the truth, she started crying. She said she'd recognized the name immediately at lunch because one of the victims was her friend's 6-year-old grandson. She'd been to his birthday party just a month before the accident. She hadn't known how to tell me without ruining my pregnancy joy, so she kept hoping I'd find out on my own or change my mind. Every time she heard Gwen, she pictured that little boy's face, and it broke her heart. Later that night, I sat in the nursery, holding my daughter as she slept in my arms. Looking at her perfect, innocent little face, the realization hit me like a physical blow. Keeping this name would mean she'd grow up with everyone connecting her to a child killer. Teachers would recognize it, treat her differently. Other parents would whisper at school events. Kids would Google her name someday and find all these horrifying articles. My dream name had become a living nightmare, a shadow that would follow her everywhere. The next morning, I called the Vital Records office. The woman on the phone said I had a narrow window to amend the birth certificate without going through court proceedings, but I needed to act within the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, it would become much more complicated and expensive. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was changing the baby. It was my boss. He asked how I was doing, then got quiet. HR needs to meet with me when I come back from maternity leave, he said. He promised my job was safe, but they have to address what happened with my coworkers getting so upset about the name thing. I thanked him and hung up, feeling sick to my stomach. Now even my workplace was permanently affected by this agonizing mess. That afternoon, Stella showed up at my door, a huge gift basket overflowing with baby clothes, diapers, and toys. She hugged me tight, her voice thick with regret. She was so sorry for how she'd reacted at the baby shower, for leaving like that. She explained that her nephew went to the same school as one of the children who died in that accident, and the whole community was still dealing with the trauma. Hearing that name had just brought everything flooding back, and she couldn't handle it in that moment. I told her I understood, now that I knew the whole story, and we both cried a little, holding each other. After she left, I sat at my laptop, searching for other names that sounded similar to Gwen, or had the same meaning. Gwyneth, Gwendolyn, Guiver. But each one felt wrong when I said them out loud. It was like betraying the daughter I'd been imagining since I was 12. But I kept looking. I had to find something. Ryan came home from work, exhausted, and found me surrounded by baby name books and printouts. He sat down beside me, suggesting maybe we could keep Gwen as her middle name, but never use it publicly. I thought about it, but then the truth dawned. Her full name would still appear on school records, at doctors' offices, anywhere official paperwork was needed. The idea of teachers seeing it on their class lists or other parents noticing it on forms made me feel sick. The next morning, the pediatrician's office called to schedule our 2-week checkup. The receptionist asked for the baby's name for their system, and I could hear her stumble over saying Gwen when I told her. She asked twice if she had the spelling right, her discomfort palpable. We're actually in the process of changing it, I said, and her sigh of relief was almost audible. Later that week, I found a support group for new mothers. I bundled up the baby and drove over, desperate to connect with other moms going through normal struggles. When we went around the circle introducing ourselves, I just said, "This is my daughter," without using her name. Everyone seemed visibly relieved. One mom even smiled at me, a look of profound understanding in her eyes. That evening, my cousin texted me a bunch of screenshots from social media. People in our neighborhood were gossiping about my choice to name the baby Gwen. She'd been defending me, telling people I didn't know about the accident, but they were discussing whether I'd done it on purpose for attention. Some were saying I must be a terrible person to choose that name, others wondered if I had mental health issues. Reading through all the comments made me feel like the entire community was against me. At 3 in the morning, rocking my baby, everything just hit me at once. I started sobbing, heartbroken over losing the name I'd carried in my heart since I was 12, how utterly unfair it all was. Ryan heard me and came in, wrapping his arms around both of us. He kept promising we'd find something beautiful, something that wouldn't hurt her, assuring me that the name didn't matter as much as our love for her. The next day, the social worker from the hospital called to follow up. She offered counseling services for difficult postpartum decisions, and kept emphasizing that changing a name doesn't change how much you love your daughter. She gave me the number for a therapist specializing in helping new parents work through unexpected challenges. After I hung up, I went into the nursery and pulled out a fresh notebook. I started writing a long letter to my daughter about the name Gwen and what it had meant to me. I wrote about picking it at 12 after reading about a brave, smart, kind character. I explained how I'd imagined calling her name at the park, signing it on birthday cards, cheering it at her graduation. I told her about finding out why everyone reacted so badly, and how I had to let go of the name to protect her from a lifetime of pain. I wrote that she was always wanted and loved, no matter what we called her. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and sealed it in an envelope, to give her when she was older so she'd understand everything that happened. My mother showed up the next afternoon, carrying a thick baby name book with colorful tabs sticking out from dozens of pages. She'd marked every name that started with G, or had similar sounds to Gwen. We sat at the kitchen table, going through each one while the baby slept beside us. Her eyes got watery when she saw me writing down possibilities, trying them out loud. She kept squeezing my hand, finally admitting she should have told me the truth from the beginning, instead of hoping I'd figure it out myself. Ryan came home from work looking utterly drained. He sat down heavily, telling me his co-workers had been asking all week if we'd really gone through with naming the baby Gwen. His manager had even sent out a department email about maintaining professional communication after someone made a joke about child killers in the break room that made another employee cry. He showed me the email, carefully worded to avoid mentioning our situation directly, but everyone would know what it was about. That night, I stayed up, searching deeper into the case. I found an old social media profile for the convicted woman. It listed her hometown as just 2 streets over from where we live now. Her parents still lived in the neighborhood, according to property records. That explained why everyone's reaction was so intense. They probably worried we were related to her, or trying to make some kind of sick statement. The next day, I went back to the library to print more articles. The librarian, who'd been helping me access the archives, asked if I needed to talk. She mentioned her daughter had been in the same grade as one of the victims and pulled me into a hug when I started crying right there between the stacks. At my 6-week checkup, the doctor kept glancing at my chart, asking how I was handling everything with the baby, if I needed extra support. She wrote me a referral for a therapist specializing in postpartum issues and identity challenges, saying it might help to talk to someone neutral. I spent the next 3 days poring over name websites and baby books until I finally found it, Gwyneth. It felt close enough to keep a connection to my original choice, but distinctly different enough that nobody would make the association. Ryan's whole body visibly relaxed when I told him. He immediately agreed it was perfect, pulling me into his arms, saying we could finally move forward. That Friday, we drove to the Vital Records office. A clerk helped us fill out the amendment paperwork. She didn't ask any questions, but she gave me an encouraging smile when she saw we were changing from Gwen to Gwyneth. I sent a group text to my family with just the word, Gwyneth. Within minutes, my phone was flooded with heart emojis and messages of relief from everyone. My sister texted separately that she could finally post photos of the baby on social media without worrying about people recognizing the name and causing problems. The HR meeting I'd been dreading turned out better than expected. They apologized for the threatening tone of the earlier conversation but explained that 3 employees had experienced actual panic attacks when they heard we'd chosen that name. We worked out an understanding. I wouldn't discuss the original name at work, and they'd make sure everyone treated me normally when I returned from maternity leave. My mother-in-law came by that weekend with a soft pink blanket she'd had embroidered with Gwyneth in beautiful script letters. Even though it stung, seeing physical proof that Gwen was truly gone, I appreciated her trying to show support for the change. The therapist's office had plain white walls and a brown couch that squeaked when I sat down for my first appointment 2 weeks later. She asked me to start from the beginning. So, I told her everything, loving the name since I was 12, nobody explaining what was wrong. When I got to the part about finally finding out about the drunk driver who killed those kids, her face remained calm, but she wrote something in her notebook. She asked how I felt about Ryan not telling me. And I surprised myself by saying I was mad at him. Really mad, actually, because he could have saved us all this pain by just explaining from the start, instead of letting me look crazy to everyone. The therapist nodded, saying it was normal to feel angry when someone withholds important information, even if they think they're protecting us. Ryan started seeing his own therapist the next week after I told him how upset I was that he'd kept quiet. He came home from his first session looking tired, but said the therapist helped him see he had a pattern of avoiding hard conversations that went way back. His therapist gave him homework: practice having one difficult conversation each week, starting with telling his mom about a work problem he'd been hiding. The new mom support group met every Thursday, and I finally worked up the nerve to share our story at my 4th meeting. The other women listened without judgment. One mom said she had to change her son's name after finding out it was the same as her husband's affair partner from years ago. Another woman changed her daughter's middle name when she learned it belonged to a relative who'd abused her as a child. They all understood having to let go of something you thought was perfect, and it helped to know I wasn't alone. 3 weeks after we filed the paperwork, the mail carrier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was the new birth certificate, Gwyneth, officially printed as her legal name. I put it in the baby book, along with the sealed letter I'd written about why we originally chose Gwen and had to change it. The book would tell her whole story someday when she was old enough to understand. My first day back at work was awkward until word spread about the name change. Then, people started warming up again. A coworker whose daughter went to the same school as the victims pulled me aside at lunch to thank me for understanding why the name was so painful for everyone. She said she'd been having nightmares about those kids since the accident, and hearing we'd chosen that name brought it all back. More people started sitting with me at lunch, and the whispers stopped completely after a few days. Stella texted, asking if we could meet for coffee. When I showed up with the baby, she was already there with her own daughter sleeping in a carrier. She apologized again for walking out of my shower instead of calmly explaining what was wrong. I told her I understood, and we spent the next hour catching up like nothing had happened. The barista kept smiling at us as our baby slept through the whole conversation. By the time Gwyneth turned 3 months old, I could finally say her name without my voice catching or feeling like I was betraying my original choice. She'd started smiling whenever she heard her name, and those little grins made something inside me heal bit by bit. Her eyes would light up, and she'd kick her legs with excitement when I sang her name during diaper changes. We decided to have a small party to officially celebrate Gwyneth, just our closest family, since the baby shower had been so tense. Everyone showed up looking relaxed and happy in a way they couldn't before, and the house filled with actual laughter for the first time in months. My dad held her up and made a toast to Gwyneth, while everyone raised their glasses of champagne or juice. My mom pulled me into the kitchen while everyone was eating cake and told me she'd been telling all her friends how proud she was that I put my daughter's well-being first. She said it proved I was already a wonderful mother, and I started crying happy tears right there by the sink. She held me while I sobbed, repeating how sorry she was for not explaining sooner, but how proud she was of how I handled everything. Ryan came home from work the next week looking lighter than he had in months. He said the harassment at his job had completely stopped. His co-workers found out about the name change through office gossip, and several people apologized for making him uncomfortable about something that wasn't his fault. One guy even admitted he'd been avoiding Ryan because the name reminded him of his nephew who was in the same class as one of the victims. The whole office atmosphere changed once they knew we'd made the change, and Ryan could finally eat lunch in the break room without people staring or whispering. That same week, while scrolling through parenting sites during a late-night feeding, I found an online forum called Name Changers Anonymous. The group had over 3,000 members, and the pinned post explained it was for parents who'd changed their baby's name for any reason. I typed out my whole story in the introduction thread, and within an hour, had 23 responses from parents who'd been through similar situations. One mom had named her son after a beloved uncle, only to discover the uncle had been arrested for fraud 2 weeks after the birth certificate was filed. Another dad picked a name that turned out to be shared with a local serial killer from the 1980s that everyone in his town still remembered. A woman from Canada wrote that she'd chosen a beautiful name that meant something horrible in the local Indigenous language and only found out when a coworker pulled her aside. Reading their stories made my chest feel less tight for the first time in weeks. These people understood the specific pain of letting go of a name you'd loved and the guilt of feeling like you'd somehow failed your baby. The moderator sent me a private message with links to articles about name changes and statistics showing it happened more often than people realized. At my next therapy appointment, I brought up what I'd learned from the group. My therapist nodded, taking notes. She asked me to describe what I loved about the name Gwen, and I talked for 20 minutes about how it felt strong but feminine, how I'd imagined calling it across playgrounds. Then, she asked me to describe my actual daughter without using any name at all. And I found myself talking about her tiny fingers, the way she scrunched her nose when she yawned. The therapist pointed out that everything I loved about my baby existed completely separate from any name, and that Gwyneth was becoming her own person already. She said the attachment I'd felt to Gwen was really an attachment to the idea of having a daughter. And now that love had transferred to the actual baby in my arms. I left that session feeling lighter and stopped at the store on the way home to buy a onesie that said, Gwyneth, in pink letters. 6 months passed. I ran into an old coworker at the grocery store who asked about the baby. When she asked the name, I said, Gwyneth, without any hesitation or need to explain the whole story. The coworker said it was beautiful and moved on to asking about sleep schedules and feeding and all the normal new parent stuff. I realized later that night that I'd gotten through the whole conversation without feeling defensive or ashamed about the name situation. Ryan noticed the change, too, and mentioned over dinner that I seemed more relaxed lately when people asked about the baby. We'd been going to couples counseling since Gwyneth was 2 months old, to work through the communication problems that the name crisis had revealed. The therapist helped us develop a system where we checked in every Sunday night about anything bothering us, so nothing could build up like the name's secret had. Ryan admitted he still felt guilty about not telling me sooner but understood why he'd been paralyzed by not wanting to ruin my pregnancy joy. We practiced having difficult conversations about smaller things first, like household chores and money, until we got better at being honest without being hurtful. Our relationship felt stronger than before the whole mess started, because we'd learned to actually talk instead of avoiding hard topics. My sister called one afternoon while I was feeding Gwyneth to share that she was 12 weeks pregnant with her first baby. She laughed and said she'd already sent her list of potential names to our parents and Ryan's family for approval. We both knew she was half joking, but there was real wisdom in getting input before getting attached to something that might cause problems. She asked if I had any name suggestions, and I gave her a few that I'd considered when looking for alternatives to Gwen. Later that week, I decided to write about our experience on my personal blog that usually only family and close friends read. I spent 3 hours typing up the whole story, from the first reactions through the name change, and what I'd learned about community trauma and the power of names. Before publishing, I asked Ryan to read it, and he suggested a few edits to protect people's privacy, but said I should share it if I wanted to. Within 2 days, the post had been shared over 1,000 times, and my inbox filled with messages from parents who'd been through similar experiences. One woman in Texas had named her daughter after a teacher who'd inspired her, only to learn the teacher had been fired for inappropriate conduct the year after she graduated. A couple in Maine chose a name that turned out to be identical to a local politician who'd embezzled from the school district. Parents shared stories about changing names due to family conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, and associations they couldn't have predicted. The blog post ended up on a few parenting websites, and I got interview requests from 2 podcasts about baby naming. I turned them down because I wasn't ready to be that public about something so personal, but it felt good knowing our story helped other people feel less alone. Gwyneth turned 9 months old on a Tuesday and hit every single developmental milestone right on schedule. She could sit up on her own, had started crawling everywhere, and babbled constantly in her own little language. Strangers at the park would stop to comment on what a happy baby she was and ask her name. When I'd tell them, Gwyneth, they'd say how pretty it was, and I could honestly thank them without any complicated feelings. At her 9-month checkup, the pediatrician commented on how well she was thriving, and I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with what we called her. The nurse who'd been there for every appointment since birth mentioned she was glad we'd found a name that worked for everyone. I knew she remembered the tension from those early visits when I could barely say Gwen without crying. Now I could chat easily about Gwyneth's eating habits and sleep patterns like any other mom. That weekend we took her to the park. I watched her playing in the sandbox with another baby while their dad and I made small talk. She grabbed fistfuls of sand and laughed when it ran through her fingers. I realized the whole name drama felt like something that happened years ago instead of just months. She looked up at me with those big eyes that were turning from baby blue to what would probably be brown like Ryan's, and squealed with delight when I smiled at her. This was Gwyneth, my daughter. Perfect exactly as she was, and I couldn't imagine calling her anything else now. This journey taught me that sometimes, the things we hold on to most tightly, the dreams we cherish the longest, aren't actually about the thing itself, but about the love and hope they represent. I lost a name, yes, but I gained a deeper connection with my daughter, a stronger relationship with my husband, and a profound understanding of how interconnected we all are in a community. And in the end, that's a far greater gift than any name could ever be. So tell me, have you ever had to let go of a deeply held dream or make a choice that brought you unexpected pushback from everyone around you? What did you do? I'd love to hear your stories and insights in the comments below.